Hello and welcome to the second instalment of my Show Me tutorials on the autonomic nervous system. In this one we're going to be dealing with the neurotransmitters involved when autonomic fibres communicate with each other and the effects of autonomic stimulation on the body. So we'll be looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems individually. We won't be dealing with different types of receptors, so for receptor types and different types of action created at different receptors, then you need to look at your physiology and pharmacology notes. So let's start with the sympathetic nervous system, and what we're going to describe is three different ways or modes of action of how the sympathetic nervous system can have an effect on organs in the body. And so we're going to start with number one, which is really probably the most common way in terms of the number of functions associated with this type of pathway. We are going to start by drawing a neuron and use red to continue with the sympathetic theme. And so this red dot here represents the cell body, the long bit in the middle represents the axon, and then we have got the communication with the dendrites onto a second neuron, which I'm going to draw in blue. And this is going to be exactly the same. So before we start describing the connections of neurotransmitters, we just need to remind ourselves actually that this nerve cell body here would reside inside the spinal cord. And if you've looked at my first tutorial, then you'll know that in the spinal cord we have a particular segment of that spinal cord where we'd expect to find sympathetic nerve cell bodies in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, and that would be somewhere between T1 and L2. So we can remind ourselves of that. So this nerve cell body over here, this is in the spinal cord. It sends its axon out of the spinal cord, and it does so via either spinal nerves or other types of nerves called splanchnic nerves, and that nerve will eventually communicate with another neuron. So the neuron in red here is given a name, and it's known as the preganglionic neuron. Okay, it's kind of like a presynaptic neuron. The second nerve in this sequence is known as the postganglionic neuron. And the nerve cell body that we can see here is located somewhere in the periphery. And often the name given to these types of neuron are often called collateral ganglia. Sometimes in anatomy though we call them prevertebral ganglia. And really a ganglion is a collection of nerve cell bodies in the periphery, and normally in gross anatomy we can see them as an extension or a widening of the axons that creates a kind of solid mass of tissue in a kind of mesh-like network that can often be seen with the naked eye, but not always. You might see some of these in your practical classes. They're normally associated in the midline of the body and normally associated with the aorta as well. So we've got a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. Now the preganglionic neuron communicates with the postganglionic neuron using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, so put ACH in there, and the postganglionic neuron has an impact on its effector organ, and it does so using the neurotransmitter which is norepinephrine. Okay, so this is the first way in which the sympathetic nervous system can have an impact on the body. What are the main functions of this? Well, we can label them. We can start off with A, and the first type of impact would be on cardiac muscle. So we would expect to see some kind of acceleration of heart rate. So we'd see an increase in heart rate and cardiac muscle activity. So here we would expect to find an increase in heart rate and an increase in the strength of cardiac contractions, and this would signify to us that the heart is working harder and circulating blood at a high rate, and under increased pressures. Secondly, we would expect some impact on the respiratory system. So in the respiratory system, we'd expect to see dilation of the respiratory passageways, and airflow becomes more efficient. So we have an increase in respiration as a result of that. And C, one of the other things that happens here is that we see a decrease in what we call the enteric nervous system. Now, you may not have heard of that, but essentially when you hear that term, enteric nervous system, it's a nervous system that surrounds the tubes of the gut, and that's because the gut walls are lined by smooth muscle, and sympathetic nerves are innervating the smooth muscle in here. And of course, we'd expect to find a general constriction of the smooth muscle, and not just in the gut wall, which is stopping the process of digestion and making more energy available for skeletal muscle, for example, but we'd also expect to see constriction of cutaneous blood vessels in the skin as well. So that is the method 1, or mode of action 1, which is the main way in which sympathetic nervous system has an impact on the body. The second way is really an odd man out, so we're going to draw number 2 here. We've got a very similar anatomical setup. We have a pre-ganglionic nerve here, and that connects to a post-ganglionic nerve. So here's our pre and post ganglionic neurons, as we've seen before. And in this example, we have the pre-ganglionic neuron utilizing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, but the post-ganglionic fiber, the post-ganglionic neuron, is also using ACH on its effector organs as well. And really this is the odd man out, and we must remember that this is about sweat glands only, sweat glands and stimulation of them. Okay, so do remember that when we're dealing with sympathetic activation of sweat glands, that the neurotransmitter involved in both the pre and post ganglionic fibers is acetylcholine, both pre and post. So, what about our third example of sympathetic activity? Well, in this example, we have a setup where we have quite a long pre-ganglionic fibre. So again, this is our pre-ganglionic neuron, and our cell body up here is the this end here. And again, we're going to see acetylcholine utilised here. But this neuron here does not connect with a post-ganglionic neuron. It goes straight to an organ, and that organ is the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland is a gland that sits on the superior pole of both kidneys, so you'll find 2 in the body. They are roughly triangular shaped. We're going to represent them by a kind of triangle here, and they have an inner core component called the medulla and an outer component known as the cortex. And our pre-ganglionic neuron is going to the adrenal medulla, so it's going to go into the gland itself, all the way into the adrenal medulla, where it's going to connect with a certain type of cell inside the adrenal medulla called a chromaffin cell. And the chromaffin cell is an interesting cell because essentially it's like a modified neuron. It's part neuron, part cell. Now, in this example, we have the chromaffin cell, which is really acting like the postganglionic fibre. So if we redraw the preganglionic neuron above, so I've just done a replication of what's above, and I'm going to draw on what a chromaffin cell kind of looks like. It doesn't really look like this, but it's kind of like this. A little nucleus in there. This is a chromaffin cell, and if you think of a postganglionic fibre that's having an impact on an effector organ, the chromaffin cell acts like the postganglionic fibre, but instead of releasing neurotransmitter to have an impact on viscera, it actually releases norepinephrine and epinephrine directly into the bloodstream. So the chromaffin cell, which is here, is releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine directly into the bloodstream. It's not having an impact on an effector organ. So what is this particular method of communication for? Well, it's generally referred to as something called sympathetic activation. Now, sympathetic activation tends to kick in when the body thinks it's in a bit of a crisis, and one of the reasons for secreting noradrenaline and adrenaline directly into the bloodstream is that it can have a more widespread effect, and the impact of adrenaline and noradrenaline can last a little bit longer in blood. So, under what kind of circumstances might we expect to experience sympathetic activation? Well, we would expect it in the fight or flight response, and we would expect the increase in noradrenaline and adrenaline to cause an increase in alertness in parts of the brain that would make us more highly aroused, so we'd be more aware of danger around us. We'd expect to find an increase in the activity of cardiovascular and respiratory centres that control our breathing and our heart rate. We'd expect a general elevation in muscle tone, and again, more energy would become available to skeletal muscle, and processes like digestion, as we've described, would be starved of nutrients and oxygen, and that would be made available for skeletal muscle so that it could be used at very short notice. And we need mobilisation of those energy reserves, so we'd need the acceleration of the breakdown of products like glycogen in muscle and liver cells, and the release of lipids for energy use. So that's the kind of things that we'd expect to experience by the release of the noradrenaline and adrenaline into the bloodstream by these specialised chromaffin cells that belong inside the adrenal medulla and are stimulated by the preganglionic nerve that stretches from the spinal cord all the way to the adrenal gland itself. Okay, so they are the three ways in which the sympathetic nervous system have an impact on bodily function. We now must finally move on and talk about the parasympathetics, and think about how the neurons, I should say, connect to each other to have an impact on what that impact is on the body. So the parasympathetic action tends to be the rest and digest response. So this anatomical setup, apart from coming from different parts of the nervous system, so we've got a craniosacral part. So if we remember back to the first tutorial, some of the parasympathetics are going to be from a cranial portion, and they are the cranial nerves, and part of it is going to be from a sacral division, a sacral component, which is the segments S2 to S4. So we must remember that when we draw our, we'll draw it in blue, our preganglionic neuron here, this cell body is still in the spinal cord, but it has to be somewhere either in the cranial portion or the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So it's either going to be a cranial nerve, and if it's in the body, then it can only be one. It has to be cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve, because only that really is going to stretch into the body. The rest of the cranial nerves are going to just have a function inside the skull. So it's either going to be the vagus nerve, or it's going to be a sacral outflow from S2 to S4. So essentially, this nerve cell body is either in the spinal cord itself, coming from S2 to S4, or is the vagus nerve coming from high up in the medulla oblongata. However, this preganglionic neuron is still a preganglionic neuron, and it still connects to a postganglionic neuron, and the postganglionic neuron here is resembled much as it was with the sympathetic nervous system. Here we have a system which utilizes acetylcholine between preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, and also utilizes acetylcholine as on its effector organ. So the parasympathetics use acetylcholine always, whether it's between the preganglionic and the post, or the postganglionic neuron and the effector organ. So what kind of functions would we expect to find, what kind of things would we expect to find being controlled by the parasympathetic division? Well, we can list these again. Go back to the black and A. This time we're going to see a reduction in heart rate, the opposite to the sympathetic stimulation. So we're going to see a reduction in heart rate and force of contraction. B is that we're going to see constriction of the respiratory passageway. So we're going to see a reduction
Subscribe to Soton Brain Hub for more videos to help explain the mysteries of the brain.